Thank you for joining today's executive session, where I discuss spending trends and spending amounts of the different stimulus bills coming from the U.S. federal government. I'm Doug Meskar, and you are now in session.
Attendees, thank you so much for joining our next installment of our executive session, this being the decoding of the ARP plans. I'm Adam Geary. I'm your managing partner of Strategist Group and today's moderator. You're joined by Doug Meskar, former member of the U.S. DOE congressional staff with over 20 years of public and private sector education experience, and Tom Luna, former state chief of Idaho, past president of CCSSO. We founded the executive series to operationalize intelligence to support your business, providing advanced guidance to allow you to best predict the impacts on education, and most importantly, provide exceptional client care and value. From a business planning side, today's overview is meant to provide you with some targets, understand how states are spending and how you can actionize against that. Here's a summary analysis. There's a lot left, and there's a lot that you can be doing to engage in that market. A few rules for the road. I'll be managing the chat box, so please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and we will take them in the order which they arrive. And without any further ado, let me turn it over to Mr. Doug Meskar, who will be your host.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adam. I'll be driving the slides and bringing Tom into the conversation along the way. So I'm going to cover a little bit of ground that you may be familiar with, but like a good teacher, I want to scaffold the new information on top of what we know. So we're going to touch base on just the stimulus packages, just remind ourselves of the money and the timelines. We're going to talk a little bit about learning loss, the expansive definition of that. We're going to get into that because that's driving a lot of conversation. Then we're going to dive into the stimulus spending, what we know, what we don't know, what we expect to be coming. There's a lot of ground there. And then we'll cover some of the short-term versus long-term. One of the areas I'm hearing a lot of conversation around is how do we take this large amount of funding, spend it wisely, have a massive impact when these dollars run out, which tends to drive a short-term lens. But there are some long-term opportunities, and we'll talk about how to sustain investments over time. And then, of course, your questions. Please use the chat box along the way. We're going to kind of run through here the content, but we want your questions. We'd love to get your engagement and your thoughts as we go along. So that is what we're going to cover. Let me hop then to the overview, which first I want to say after this presentation, we developed a nice little 2-pager, little handy just guide to all the acronyms, the timelines, the amounts. We're going to send this afterwards so you can have that handy and just use it however you want. Just a reference guide. There's a lot to keep track of, which is, a stimulus package is coming due when and how much and all that business. So we'll send this to you afterwards. But let's dive into the details of what's driving the spending. Now, this is not necessarily new. You may remember this from a prior conversation. And it's important to point out that this hasn't changed. In fact, you see states and districts doubling down, tripling down on how to address learning loss. And yes, I'm going to use that phrase for this presentation because the American Rescue Plan used that phrase. I know some call it accelerated learning, recovering lost instructional time. For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to call it learning loss. SEL, social emotional learning, and mental health. Priorities 1A, 1B, maybe equivalent, maybe both 1, and there's no A and B, but they are the top priorities far and away. And we'll show you some data on why that's the case. And then, we got to keep these schools open. We got to keep districts open. And so a lot of spending to date has gone to addressing that issue. That's starting to tail off as we've, I think, gotten more into the normal day-to-day. But these are the 3 areas, right, that are driving stimulus funding. And that stimulus funding has to be linked to by the legislation. These are broad categories. But remember, all this stimulus money isn't just for whatever. It's really meant to address the impacts of the pandemic around these 3 major areas. Tom, would you see anything different or additional to these three major areas of spending?
No, I think it's been remained pretty consistent, and we've seen it repeated over and over with the documentation and correspondences between the states and the federal government, and applications that are submitted where they identify their priorities. These have remained pretty consistent.
Yep. And we will show you more detail about these, as well as some other areas that are starting to creep in. But these are the big three, if you will. So always keep these in mind as we go forward. So let's talk about specific numbers just for a minute. These may be familiar to you. You know, the CARES Act back from last March, the smallest amount, 31 billion for education overall, 13 billion for ESSER. Then you've got the CRRSA from December, 82 billion, 54 billion for ESSER, and then the American Rescue Plan, obviously the biggest one of all. Overall, 167 billion for education, 123 billion for the ESSER fund. Under the GEAR fund, or the governor's fund, you know, those numbers have been going down, and the EANS, or the emergency assistance for non-public schools, going up. Now, I rounded up on this chart. It's really 2.75 billion for EANS, but you know what I'm talking about. The higher ed fund, and then broadband is another important additional funding stream. And there's more to come on broadband. Some of the proposals in front of Congress are looking to add a lot more spending to broadband, and a lot of the broadband money is starting to flow out. So if you haven't seen that from the FCC, they've opened up, they just actually closed, didn't open, but closed a second window to get applications for the emergency connectivity fund under the ARP. So as that as a backdrop, let's also just remind ourselves, so each of the ESSER funds, if you total them up, it's about 188, 189 billion, depending on how you count a couple of things. All of the ESSER funds were distributed in the same way, 90% down to the districts, 10% at the state level, and all based on the Title I proportionate share of that state or district. So that's just common. Now, all of these added together are roughly about 4,000 per pupil on average. Now, there's no such thing as an average district, so the amount districts are receiving is going to vary, and it will be varied based on the amount of poverty that's in the district. So high poverty districts getting much more than 4,000 per student, low poverty districts much less. Again, your average district, about a 30% bump in their overall budget, varying again based on poverty. And then one point I'm going to plant a seed for you on and come back to is these concepts about maintenance of effort, and more importantly, maintenance of equity. So I'll say more about that later, but that's important to note that when you get to the ARP, ESSER 3, maintenance of equity becomes a really important conversation. And then again, with the American Rescue Plan, you may know this, at the state level, there are set asides for evidence-based interventions, another topic we will spend some time on, learning loss, summer learning, and after school. And then at the district level, again, you may know this, 20% for learning loss at the district level. The thing I want to point out with all of these percentages, the 5%, the 1%, the additional 1% at the state level, and then the 20% at the district level, these are minimums. They're not maximums. So if a district wanted to spend more than 20% of their ARP ESSER dollars on learning loss, they could certainly do that. All right, let's keep plugging along here. So we've covered some ground, and we all know that these funds are very flexible. There's 20 different authorized uses of funds, very broad categories, everything under CARES Act, CRRSA, and then these funds can be used for any activity under the Every Student Succeeds Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Adult Education Family Literacy, Perkins CTE, McKinney-Vento Homeless. So very broad. And, you know, ARP added some additional categories. They didn't limit anything. They more of just made some things more specific, with the one exception, the aforementioned learning loss or lost instructional time. And I just put here the specific language that I included in the federal legislation. You know, there's some key phrases here around high quality assessments, accurately assessing students' progress, assisting educators in meeting academic needs, differentiating instruction, evidence-based activities, there's that phrase again, to meet the comprehensive needs of students, information and assistance to parents, supporting students, as well as tracking attendance, improving student engagement and education. So very broad, but you can see there's some focus in the federal legislation around particular concepts, not to the exclusion of other ways of using these dollars, but you know that these are things that they'll be looking for as the data starts to roll in, which we will talk about in just a minute. So I want to spend a minute on learning loss. I think this is really, really important for you all to know this phrase around evidence-based interventions. So as districts and states are addressing learning loss or summer school or after school, they have to be using interventions that have an evidence basis. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a term of art in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So there's 4 tiers of evidence they're on the next slide that we'll talk about. But I just want to point out here, I mentioned it before, but learning loss is not just academic. The legislation defined it as also including the social and emotional needs. So when we talk about learning loss, sometimes folks just think academically. It's broader than that. It's the comprehensive view of student improvement. So when we talk about evidence-based, there are 4 tiers of evidence. So strong, moderate, promising, and then demonstrating a rationale. And so for these, as I get them all on screen here, tier 1 is a randomized control trial, right? That is the highest tier. Some think it's not really even possible to do this with education interventions, but that's the old What Works clearinghouse. You have, control and experimental group. Then there's moderate and promising, which are, mixing together qualitative and quantitative evidence. And then tier 4, though, this is the 4th level, the lowest level, a demonstrating a rationale, which is often interpreted as a logic model. And a logic model, if you Google that, there's lots of examples, but basically it's, hey, with a given intervention, if it's implemented in the appropriate ways, what outcomes am I going to see over time? So it's really a theory, right? Now, with these logic models and these approaches of theories, there has to be some research behind that. It doesn't have to be specific to your program or to a specific program, but the approach of the intervention needs to have some evidentiary basis and research. Doesn't have to be a lot, but I'm hearing more and more conversation around, as we look at the expenditure of these dollars, there's going to be some examination of what is the evidence that you looked at to determine this was a really smart use, really effective use of these dollars. And if you don't have that evidence base, even that tier 4, which is the lowest level, it's really the easiest one to get over, but you still need to have it. So I want to emphasize that it's a growing conversation. In fact, I talked to one of our clients just today who was talking with a district, and they actually raised this and said, I really need to know what your evidentiary basis is to continue this conversation, because we're required to have that in order to spend at least the 20% of the ESSER dollars on learning loss. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, learning loss, right? That's the popular term. We're all talking about it. Really, what we're talking about is achievement gaps just sort of exacerbated to the nth degree. I've got some data on the chart here, or on the different charts. When you look at graduation rates, there's historical inequities between, white students, Black students, Hispanic students in terms of the numbers graduating, right? Which is often what a lot of people point to. The graduation rate's been going up overall. That's true on average, but not for every subgroup. And then, with NAEP, there's been historical, long-standing inequities in reading and math. And in fact, there was some new NAEP data that just came out the other week that just even more emphasized this point that these historic achievement gaps have been there. They've been there for a long time. they've closed a little, they've opened more, but they've been there, and learning loss is just making those bigger. And so part of the point here that I want to drive to is just returning to the pre-pandemic status quo is not really doing some of these kids much good, because yeah, you might have addressed their learning loss during the pandemic, but they still may be grades or years behind their more well-off peers, et cetera. So Tom, I just, your thoughts here as a former state chief, you've worked with, these achievement gaps and closing them. What are your thoughts in terms of, how the pandemic has sort of made some of these historical achievement gaps worse?
Yeah, I think it's definitely got the attention of those that have always focused their efforts on closing these achievement gaps and drawing attention to them. And Doug, into the rest of the folks participating, we've also beginning to realize that we have a whole new group of at-risk kids. And these are kids that have always been at grade level or above. That's what they're used to. That's what their parents are used to. And for the first time, they're not at grade level. And so this is a new experience for them. It's a new experience for their parents. And so, focusing on assuring that we don't end up with a long-term growing group of at-risk kids when we've always hoped and worked to get that number to go down, recognizing that we have a whole new category of at-risk kids is definitely driving conversations about closing these gaps, bringing those kids back to their academic level that they were before the pandemic, which for many of them was at grade level or above. And now for the first time, like I said, they're not at grade level, and dealing with that and finding solutions to it is a big conversation that's going on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom, for that. And let's dig in. There's a growing amount of data, different assessments that you can look at. They're all pretty consistent. This data is from Curriculum Associates. It's a little bit of a busy table, but essentially what you're looking at is by demographic and looking at schools that have more than 50% of their students that are Black, Latino, or white. When you look at the size of the decline, so what's their, historic achievement, and then where are they coming in from, past to this spring or the current spring numbers. And you can see that Black students in schools with more than 50% of their students that are Black, they're 12 points below where they historically have been. And you can see kind of that stair step. This is true in reading and math, so the data is really bearing this out. And you're seeing, both immediate sort of engagement around how do we address this. But then again, we're also starting to hear that conversation around, great, well, if we get these scores back to where they were, that still doesn't mean that they're where they ought to be in, going forward. So this is one example of the data. There's others out there. It's pretty undeniable what's going on. So couple of resources that you may not be aware of as states and districts have been thinking about and engaging in how do we address these issues. I put these up here because, and I say this, and Tom, you can back me up here as former Department of Ed staffer, the resources the department puts out, maybe not always in touch with what's happening in the real world, right? They're trying to be helpful, but they're not always helpful. I would say, the reception and the examples in both of these resources, one that's specific to lost instructional time, the other on SEL and mental health, they're pretty good. They have a lot of practical examples. They cite real world, like people are doing this. And so, Tom, I heard you jump in there. So I don't normally, necessarily recommend US DOE resources in terms of what you should be doing with these dollars. But in this case, they're worth looking at. And in fact, they point to some interesting trends in the spending. Tom, anything to add?
Yeah, I would, Doug, to your point, I think, my experience working in the U.S. Department and then since is a lot of times when these kinds of resources are made available, they're very specific to a certain population or a certain challenge. and solutions to it. And so the audience was rather limited of those that were interested or needed that help. When we're talking about these resources addressing a pandemic and learning loss that is so widespread, I think that's another reason that these documents are relevant to far more people. And the people on this webinar, I think you'd see a lot of value in the examples that are used, and why these strategies were used and these services were adopted to address these issues. So I think it's very relevant to a lot more people. And unfortunately, that's just not the case often when the department puts out information and resources.
So true. Well said. Thanks, Tom. So this is probably what you all are the most interested in now that we've got the table setting in place. Let's talk about some of the trends that we're seeing. But before we do that, there's something important to talk about, because as we look at how this spending is taking place, there are some provisions, kind of wonky, but important. So one is maintenance of effort, just means that states and districts have to maintain their level of spending, and that, they can't sort of reduce their own spending. So maintenance of effort is really just, you have to maintain that level of spending. It doesn't say specifically on what. So this is looking at aggregates, and, there's averages. It's not meant to really lock people in as much as, to a specific year, as much as to say the historical average. That's not a new concept. What is a new concept is at the state level and at the district level, there's this idea of maintenance of equity. This is a fiscal provision. May not seem like it, but what it's essentially saying is, so when the state is looking at the distribution of funds, not just if they're cutting, but the overall distribution of funding within the state, high poverty districts can't be disproportionately impacted or affected negatively by the distribution of funds. So for that state to district, and then from the district to the schools, the same concept applies around making sure that high poverty schools are not disproportionately impacted. Now, a couple of wrinkles on this. One is that the U.S. Department of, well, first of all, this is a brand new concept in federal law. Nobody actually has ever done this before. I was on a call with some congressional staff at one point, they shall remain nameless, who said, yeah, we're really curious to see how this provision is going to play out. Wait, what? What did you just say? So they don't know. So this is kind of an experiment. It only applies to ARP ESSER dollars, but it's this notion, right, that high poverty districts and schools can't face disproportionate impacts from the distribution of funds. It's also true that there's not a lot of answers to what this means. So for example, does maintenance of equity apply to budgeted amounts or actual expenditures? Because we all know that there's a difference, right? There's no answer to that. So it's a little bit of a moving target. It's a brand new concept in federal law, but it's important to know about, because this push around fiscal equity and high poverty schools and districts is not going away. In fact, you can trace it back to ESSA and some of the proposed changes there. And there were some real fights between the Obama administration and, at the time, the Republican Congress around this idea of distribution of dollars within a district and within a state. So I don't want to spend a ton more time on this because it's really wonky and complicated and there's not a lot of answers, but it's something to keep in mind, that it's a pressure coming down from the federal level on states and on districts and how they spend their money. Now, this last one is really important though, and I'll come back to this around sustainability. There's this other provision in federal law called supplement, not supplant. And it's the concept that federal money needs to be a supplement, be on top of, or in addition to state and local money, not replace or supplant state and local money. For the stimulus dollars, this provision does not apply. Now, that's important because if you were funding something with state and local money, say a district was spending some money on a particular intervention, or a district was spending on a particular intervention, they could shift to federal money and then shift it back. Right? So there's some ways, or you could start something with federal money and then shift it to state and local money and not have an issue. So it provides some flexibility to allow these dollars to backfill, to be used in creative ways. And also, it doesn't get you in trouble that if you start something with federal dollars or you continue something with federal dollars, you can shift back to a different funding source and not run afoul of federal law. This is a big, it's wonky, it's detailed, but it's important because it speaks to the conversation we'll get to in a minute or two around how do you sustain some of these investments. All right, enough policy wonkery.